In this video, we are going to take a look at conference realignment, and more specifically, could UConn wind up leaving the Big East for the ACC? And yes, of course, anything could happen, but conference realignment, this is very layered, and I'm going to go through the different layers to try to untangle what might happen moving forward. Before we start, if you enjoy the content, then give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. All right, let's get into this conference realignment. So before we go forward, we need to look back. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, there was a conference, the Southwest Conference. And there was an evil villain, let's call it Darth Longhorn. And they had an evil brother, Darth Texas A&M. Yeah, you don't get off free, Texas A&M. You went along to Texas to the Big 12 and abandoned the Southwest Conference. Now, the reason I'm bitter on this, as at the time, I was a kid growing up in Houston and was probably one of the few Houston Cougar fans around. So I have seen this play run by Texas many a time, manipulating conferences and teams within the conference to get what they want and ultimately do them over. In the Big 12, Texas was like that lead singer in the band that everybody hated in the band.
And you say you love me. I don't love you, man. I never did. None of us love you. You act above us, you always have.
Finally, the truth.
You just held it over us like you might leave. Like we're lucky to be with you. And we had to live with it, man.
In much the same way, the Texas Longhorns set up their own network and made everybody in the Big 12 bend to their knees. Finally, their brother who hated them, Texas A&M, left for the SEC. And what do you know? It worked out pretty well for them. And then, of course, Texas gets jealous of this. And even though they'd gotten everything they wanted in the Big 12, they abandoned the Big 12 with Oklahoma to the SEC. And in doing so, this started a chain reaction, which ultimately led to the collapse of the Pac-12. And yes, I know the Pac-12 ultimately caused their own destruction by bad management, and they couldn't score a TV contract because they were so badly managed. But I do blame Texas in a large part for this, and then moving to the SEC. Because the Big 12 then was fighting for its life and then picked off the carcass of the Pac-12 to ensure its survival. So they got Utah, Arizona, Arizona State, and Colorado to come on board, and now they have 16 teams, despite Oklahoma and Texas leaving for the SEC, who now have 16 teams and are clearly the dominant 10,000-pound gorilla that dominates all conferences. However, there is another conference that is trying to keep up and almost equal to their dominance, which is the Big Ten, and they went out and got UCLA and USC to come aboard to their conference, and then they took the scraps of the Pac-12, which were Oregon and Washington. The Big Ten now sits at 18 teams in their conference. And well, that just leaves one big conference to talk about, which is the ACC, and they look like that wounded gazelle or baby gazelle that you'll see in the National Wildlife documentary or a David Attenborough documentary, and the predators are circling and they are in trouble. As the two best football schools in their conference, and let's get real, this is all about football, as that's what drives the money. The two best football schools, Florida State and Clemson, want to get the heck out of there as they are disgruntled about the terrible TV deal the ACC signed, which goes through 2036. These schools view themselves as big players, and they don't think they can play if they don't have the money. So hence, they are making noise about leaving the conference, and it appears it's only just a matter of time before they leave the ACC. And the real question is when and where will they go? And with the when, it could come up as soon as the 15th of August, as if they are going to leave, they need to tell the ACC prior to that date, or they will be committed to staying in the ACC in the 2025 season. Now, if they do leave, they are going to have to pay a lot of money, but as well, they will need to find somewhere to go. And currently, it does not seem like the SEC is really interested in Clemson or Florida State. In addition, the Big Ten does not seem to have any interest either in them. This would leave them with their only dance partner, which is the Big 12. And as I mentioned earlier, the Big 12 only has 16 teams, so presumably they could potentially add these two teams. I'm sure that the Big 12 was not the initial dream for Florida State and for Clemson, but hey, sometimes you have to settle and maybe they will, and that's the question. Will they decide to settle and try to go to the Big 12, or will they stick with the ACC and hope that the ACC eventually implodes, and then they will be able to join a conference which they feel is worthy of their name and brand? So how does UConn fit into all this? Well, an opportunity might come up in the next week or two to join the ACC, because if the ACC loses Florida State and Clemson, then they will need to add 2 more teams, as they will be down to 16, but to 15 football teams, as Notre Dame does not play football in the ACC. And much how the Big 12 saved themselves by getting bigger, they would probably go in the same direction, and UConn is probably the most enticing school available. Other schools mentioned are Southern Florida, Tulane, and Rice. None of them are great, and out of all 4 of those, I think it's pretty clear UConn is probably the most valued school out of all of those. Now, UConn has wanted to be in the ACC previously. They got left out originally when the ACC raided the Big East, and then in 2011, BC lobbied to keep UConn out of the ACC, ultimately chose to add Pitt, Syracuse, and then Louisville over UConn. And what I didn't mention was the ACC sort of future-proofing itself and preparing for Clemson and Florida State to leave. When the Pac-12 dissolved, they added Stanford and Cal as well. Unbelievably, in my opinion, they added SMU. So they now have 18 teams. And in a lot of ways, I think they've already messed this up pretty bad, because I think UConn was the team to add versus SMU, and that would have been smart. So if Florida State and Clemson left, then fine. Then you would still have 16 teams with Stanford, Cal, and UConn. But if Florida State and Clemson do decide to leave, I still think UConn is likely to be asked to come to the ACC, as they still want to build up their numbers to 18 in preparation in the future if Virginia and North Carolina decide to leave for the SEC. As better to make sure that you have 18 teams in case 2 of those leave unexpectedly. It's just future proofing. Now let's say the choice comes to UConn to join the ACC. What should they do? Well, on paper, you would say straight away they would join, as it's more money, and money usually drives where schools go. As well, UConn persists with their football dream of being a football power, and if they're going to follow that dream, then they need to go to the ACC, which is better for their football program. However, as Lee Corso would say, not so fast, my friend, because if you are a conspiracy theorist, you think this is all being driven by ESPN, and many think that Fox and ESPN would be quite happy to see the end of the ACC and just have 3 massive conferences, which would be the Big 12, the Big 10, and the SEC. This would allow those big conferences to pick the carcasses of what remains of the ACC, which would be basically adding the schools with the best football programs. And if this happens, then it might set up the Big East quite well, as they might find themselves being a basketball power only conference and looking to pick off the schools from the ACC that don't play football well. Schools like Wake Forest, NC State, Syracuse, and Boston College. Although I am sure UConn would love to screw Boston College and say, nah, you can't come into the Big East. We forbid it. That would be a nice little twist of fate for them. Now it is over to you. Tell me how wrong I have this and how much speculation I have done, but I will leave it with you. Do you see UConn joining the ACC if it is offered, and do you like that move, or would you prefer UConn to stay in the Big East? All your comments are welcome, especially your poison. I imagine I will get a lot of that in this video, especially from Texas fan.